don't hit that skip button because I have huge news for you. The Rewind of the Living Dead t-shirt lives. It is here. It is available to purchase. Oh yes, I'm not kidding. We finally got our Rewind of the Living Dead t-shirt out, and it's amazing. It is printed by the same company that prints for Cavity Colors and Fright Rags, which if you're a hardcore horror fan who buys a lot of horror t-shirts, I know I do, you know that's the very best and highest quality because we couldn't do anything less for our fans. It's an amazing full color design, designed by Jason Ragosta. It's very cool. It features a zombified myself, a zombified Damon, and it looks just like an awesome horror shirt because that's what we want, because we're horror fans too. So we wanted to make a t-shirt that you could really sink your teeth into. Go to rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com. Again, that's rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com to get your t-shirt today. Rewind of the Living Dead is a review show, so spoilers are ahead.
Writer-director Ted Geoghegan has openly admitted that he doesn't enjoy setting any of his projects in present day. In fact, he's gone as far as saying he hates the present day, so he will always seek to make films set in the past. For his latest film, he traveled back to 1945, just after World War II had ended, and he wanted to tackle themes that didn't just show the jubilation surrounding victory for the Allies over the Axis powers. Instead, Geoghegan knew through research that that time period was filled with a lot of despair and an alarming amount of suicides. His story deals with blind patriotism and growing paranoia, while centered around a group of lifelong friends who almost all fought together during the war. But now they've returned home, and just months after Germany and Japan have surrendered, one friend in particular is dealing with a tragedy in his personal life after his wife took her own life, and he's called upon his fellow soldiers to carry out one last mission for him, a seance that will allow him to reach out to his dead wife one last time.
God damn, it's good to see you guys.
DeFranco, get your ass out here.
Major? Major.
You're all here tonight. That's very special. It's been 6 weeks since Susie checked out.
Sweetheart, we all miss Susie.
Then please, will you humor me? With a seance, the spirits speak directly through us. If there are any spirits here, make yourselves known.
What the hell is that?
Don't you dare get up.
What?
We have to end the seance before we break the circle.
Look!
Spirits, force your way into our world with all your might. Come in. I broke the circle. That means the door isn't closed yet.
To hell with you, then.
Oh, no. You're not gonna drag us into the dark with you.
This madness is over. This war is over!
Says who?
In the latest episode of Rewind of the Living Dead, we're going to hold hands and not break the circle as we review the 2023 Shudder original, Brooklyn 45. Welcome back to Rewind of the Living Dead. I'm Damon Martin.
And I'm Patrick Guerra.
And Patrick, this week we are getting into a Shudder original, which is a new film called Brooklyn 45 from a director that I didn't actually know I was familiar with, but I am familiar with him, Ted Geoghegan. We'll get to that more in a second. But before we get started on the episode, on the actual review of Brooklyn 45, we always say at the end of the show, every single week. If you have questions, comments, movies you'd like us to review, hit us up on social media or hit us up on email. We love receiving emails from you guys. And we've gotten quite a few over the last a couple of years we've done this, but we got one in particular this week that really struck a nerve that was just awesome to see. And I thought it'd be great if we could open the episode reading that reader email and talking about our last episode, of course, where you and I reviewed The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, no, it's so awesome we get a lot of great fan outreach, and we have actually since the beginning. Weirdly, like we had some super fans like super early on, so we've been cursed in the parlance of horror with great fans who have always been engaging with us. So we love getting stuff like this. This week's email comes from Brad Michael, and he said in regards to The Silence of the Lambs, loved this episode. I was an FBI agent from 1991 to 2016 and went through Quantico not long after Jodie Foster was there. The guy who kills Starling during the training scenario was actually one of my instructors, that's super cool. Not one single person had anything but praise for how Jodie Foster handled herself while she was there. They loved her, and these were generally a bunch of crusty old senior agents. So that's a little bit of that inside dirt that nobody gets to hear, which is all these crusty old agents at the FBI loved Jodie Foster while she was there. One thing I particularly loved about the movie, after Starling shoots the shit out of James Gumb, she does something you never see in a movie after the good guys kill the bad guys. She reloads. No plot armor. Just like for real, she didn't know if he was down for the count or not. And she does textbook FBI revolver reload. It's a thing of beauty to an old firearms instructor. Thanks for the hours of entertainment. Brad Michael, FBI retired. That's super cool, Damon. Like to get some real inside dirt on one of the best movies that was ever made. And from a fan of ours, thank you, Brad, for showing his appreciation and giving us some extra inside dirt we would never found anywhere else.
Yeah, that was awesome. That was really cool. And listen, just to be clear, we love all of our listener email messages on Instagram. We've gotten a bunch of those, so we appreciate that one. The reason why we wanted to read that one on air is because that was just such a cool little insight of, the FBI. Because we talked about that during the episode, like how, through stories and what we read on research was that the FBI, like they actually went as far as using this film as like generally like how, like they actually, I won't say training footage, but like it was used as a tool of recruitment. We talked, like they said, like female applications, the FBI like tripled or quadrupled or some crazy number between when this film came out and 10 years later, and how authentic they were. And he mentioned that one of his instructors is in the film. Like, I love that. And that just shows you the authenticity that Jonathan Demme and the cast and crew of The Silence of the Lambs went for in that movie. And I just love hearing that, because you can read a lot of things online, but doesn't necessarily mean all of it's true. That kind of proves what we're talking about, the authenticity of The Silence of the Lambs, particularly where the FBI was concerned.
Yep. I mean, an old adage is a well-researched movie ends up becoming a really good movie.
Yeah, so awesome. So thank you for the email.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, we appreciate that. I think there is a reward coming your way. We'll reach out to an email, because I think Brad deserves a Rewind of the Living Dead T-shirt. Okay,
Damon.
A little enticement there. So yeah, we'll send out a T-shirt.
Holy shit, we're gonna get 3,000 emails now and be like, okay.
We're gonna send out a T-shirt to Brad. That was a really cool email. So yeah, there you go. So don't forget, you can get your own Rewinded. Let's see how I segue this.
Nice segue.
Rewind of the Living Dead T-shirt is available now. So pick yours up at rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com. Size is small through 2XL, and they are not being shipped out by a giant conglomerate or some person working in a mailroom. They are shipped out by me. They are currently sitting behind me about 3 feet to my right. So, yeah. So if you want Rewind of the Living Dead T-shirts, they are coming directly from us.
The warehouse is Damon.
Yeah, the warehouse is my apartment. So there you go. All right, Patrick, let's get into this week's episode, this week's movie, which is, funny enough, we talked about FBI. Now we're moving into military with Brooklyn 45, which is a new film that just recently opened on Shudder.
Hello, Shudder.
And I mentioned I was more familiar with Ted Gagin than I knew about, because he also did a movie set in the 70s called We Are Still Here, which I believe has the great Barbara Crampton in it. And then he did a movie called Mohawk, which came out, I believe, in 2017. The reason I'm familiar with that one is because the writer of that movie, the screenwriter of that film, is a guy by the name of Grady Hendrix, who is probably my favorite horror author currently. He wrote books like The Final Girl Support Group or Final Girl Support Club. He wrote the Southern... Oh, God, I always get this title wrong. The Southern Book Club Guide to Killing Vampires. He wrote the new book he just had come out, How to Sell a Haunted House, which is tremendous. Just an incredible author, and he wrote the screenplay to Mohawk, which was his 2017 film. So I was more familiar with Ted Gagin than I realized I was when I started reviewing this film, when I started watching this film.
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I knew about what We Are Still Here, I think is. I hadn't seen it, but I knew that movie, and I actually follow Ted on Twitter, and I actually enjoy his tweets. He's one of those guys that's out there dropping a lot of knowledge, and that's as much of a trash fire as Twitter is. The writing and the directing people on Twitter tend to be very helpful. Ted's amongst those guys.
Yeah, very cool to see that. So Brooklyn 45, as we mentioned, is set in 1945 when a group of soldiers and friends who were served together during the war get together to help one of their friends deal with the tragedy in his own life after his own wife took her life about 6 weeks earlier, and they all kind of convened to his brownstone in Brooklyn to, commiserate, to just support each other. The war has ended, and one thing I read in that interview with Ted Gagin that I mentioned in the intro, Patrick, which is interesting. First off, we were not alive during World War II.
No.
So, everything you and I know about World War II comes from history, comes from books.
Despite what every Gen Zer thinks, I'm not that old.
Yeah. Which is, it's always, that time period is really fast because it's a huge time period for a million different reasons. But it's also something that's so beyond us, like so before we were around, that we don't understand. And now, like, we're talking almost 100 years ago. I mean, it's 80 years ago almost at this point. You know what I mean? So it's really a completely different generation. And what I like that Ted Gagin mentioned in the interview that I read, that I talked about in the intro, is he said that there's this false sense of joy and celebration surrounding the end of World War II, which there was a legitimate joy around the defeat of Germany and Japan. Germany surrenders, Japan surrenders months later, and the war is over. There was genuine celebration and good feeling about that, but there were also, again, coming out of that, there is feeling of despair. There is feeling of, like, going through all that PTSD for soldiers and things like that. And then he mentioned there was, like, an abnormal rise in suicides at that time. And I think that's something that does get lost in a lot of celebratory, like, military movies like this, is the aftermath, dealing with the aftermath of such a horrendous situation. And I love that he explored that in this film, because that's something we don't see. We generally just see the celebration. You see the I'm coming home and it's the win. We won.
Yeah.
You won at the cost of thousands of people dying and lives being destroyed forever.
Your friends dying,
Yeah. So so I think I love that he pointed that out, and I did notice that, because you could tell right away. First off, let me just mention before we get into anything else with the review, we won't get into spoilers just yet. I mentioned this to you last night. We were deciding between this film and one other, which one we were going to review this week. And I started this film, Patrick, you started a different one. And I said right away, I was like, the acting is actually really well done in this film. Like, that was my first note.
I'm sorry to laugh. It is such a horror thing to say. The acting was actually pretty great.
Well, here's the thing: when you're dealing with independent horror, like,
yeah, of course,
there's when you're dealing with low budget independent horror, you're always like you're at the mercy of, like, bad acting. I mean, there's a reality there. Listen, there are horror films that I absolutely adore that do not have great acting, but I still love them.
Of course.
Some
of my all-time favorites, by the way.
Yeah, so this film right away, I was like, you know what? It's very well acted. Like, and that does. We always say this, Patrick, when you can have a cast that includes certain names or A-list, actors, that you immediately raise the bar. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have an A-list actor in a dog shit movie, because you absolutely can.
Oh, we get that all the time.
But at least in that regard, you do elevate everybody by having a good cast and good acting. And right away, And this is pretty serious subject matter. Right away, I was like, this is a really solid cast. And we're talking about a very self-contained cast because this is really shot, and I know Ted Gagin mentioned this in a number of interviews, this is basically shot like a play. It's a one-room chamber movie is what he calls it. One-room movie. You never leave this one room in the house the entire movie. And you know from a million episodes of this podcast, Patrick, I love claustrophobic horror. So right away, they hooked me in with that. And it feels like a stage play in a lot of ways. Like it feels like you could put this on a stage, build a room, put these 5 people in here, and it's a movie, but in this case, or it's a play.
I would like Ted to make this a play, actually. I think it'd be really cool. It'd be a very cool idea to do that. And this is very much like a contained, a chamber piece. And that's really, we talk about contained horror often on this show. This is truly, truly contained. I mean, there's a scene out front of the brownstone, and then everything else takes place inside that room. That's it. That's how this movie goes. They don't cut to another room. They don't cut away to other things. They rely on the performances, which, as you mentioned, are very good. And we'll give some shout outs right now. Anne Ramsey, Ron Raines, Jeremy Holm, Larry Fessenden, who a ton of horror people probably know, Ezra Buzzington, and Christina Klebe. That's it. That's your whole show. Everybody. And they're in this one room. And it's one of those things that's like, as a filmmaker myself, it's really inspiring to see because I know how that went. It was like, okay, we're going to build this stage because I'm guarantee it was probably put together on a stage somewhere somehow. And we're gonna achieve everything we need to achieve in one place. That's actually really hard to do. We've talked about it before with other films, and I think they do it to a lot of success here. There's actually great production design. If they're gonna have one room, make the room look great. It really did feel like a very old, lived-in Brooklyn brownstone with a bunch of great little artifacts and like war trinkets, et cetera, all laced around it. There was great production design. And I'm sure this was a lower budget movie. I didn't even bother checking to see how much it went for, but it feels like they spent their money really wisely. And it was great because typically, yes, horror films are not known for their amazing acting, and they're very often known for their lesser known leads. And that's a great, actually, in my opinion, an advantage of horror movies. They don't need to have well-known people in them to make them successes. And if you know any of these names, kudos to you. I didn't know everybody in the cast, but what I was impressed with was that they all had chops. They could all do their job really, really well. And as mentions in the trailer itself, the whole this gang of ex-war I don't know what to call them. This group that were fighting in World War II, they're brought together by Lieutenant Colonel Clive Hochstetter, played by Larry Fessenden. And he just recently lost his wife a few weeks back, and he wants to do this seance, and he wants to bring her back. And it's this great ensemble piece. And I love when ensemble pieces are they're perfect for horror, because you have all these different personalities and all these different strengths. And that's exactly why Hawk is what they call Larry Fessenden's character, brought these people together. They all have specialties. Anne is a interrogator. Bob is her husband, who no one seems to like. He just happened to come along for the ride, more of an intellectual type. Then there's Archie, who was the killer, who was the one who could go in and do the job. And then Paul DeFranco, he was sort of he was a tried and true military man. He was another guy who could get out there and make things happen. Full on patriot. I mean, and he really, I will say that about Paul. He really plays that military. I live in San Diego. I'm surrounded by military guys all the time. The character of Paul, Ezra Buzzington, plays him to a T. I know a lot of guys that are like that, who are just dyed in the wool military people. Yeah, and it's very interesting because with the limitations of a single room movie, you have to figure out how to keep things fresh. And Damon, I want to hear your take on this sort of idea where they do have to talk a lot. They have to actually talk about their pasts, and they have to. This is a movie where you can't show it you've got to kind of say it because there's only one room to show anything in. So they talk a lot about their past, and then they come every, I would say, 10 minutes or so with something that kind of twists the whole game and changes everything. So what was it like for you? Because the vibe I was getting from your text that night were like, I'm digging this.
Yeah, it's weird because I love claustrophobic horror. I like one room horror films. Like, I enjoy those. And another thing I want to bring up, Ted Gagin said when asked about, like, why didn't they do flashbacks? Because a lot of the exposition in this film are these veterans talking about particular moments during the war. It starts out kind of jovial and joking and, like, having fun with it, but then it gets to some pretty serious situations, which you have to understand when you've been at war in World War II. Like, you've seen and probably done some pretty horrific things. That's just part of what war is. And he said the reason he didn't want to do flashbacks was he wanted the audience to stay in this room with these soldiers. You never leave that room. That was a big point for him. You never leave that room. And if you escape to do a flashback, the audience gets out for a minute. He wanted us to be so stuck and locked into this claustrophobic room with these soldiers that we felt trapped as well, just as trapped as they did. And I love that little nuance you kind of flash in there that you don't really think about. But when he said it, I was like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool. Like, we're trapped in there with them. Like, we never leave. We never pan outside the Brookstone or flashbacks into World War II. None of that. We are in this room with those people for the entire movie, which I really enjoyed. What's funny is I feel like sometimes movies like this, there's a weird fine balancing act with exposition when you get into these things where you can talk way too much and it just drags the movie down. There's other examples where you can talk a lot and it's just brilliant. Like, this is not a movie, it's a TV show, but there's a lot of exposition in this show called Midnight Mass, which is a Mike Flanagan show on Netflix. And there's a lot of exposition, a lot of monologues on that show. And they're all really, really well done, and they all add gravitas to the story itself. Now, there's a lot of action, and of course, that's like a 7-episode or 8-episode series, so of course there's a lot more room to breathe. But the exposition in that film, that show really made that show. Like, that was like those big monologue exposition pieces were like to me the most memorable part about Midnight Mass, and I really enjoyed that series. This film is a lot of the same way, where the exposition never gets boring. It never feels drawn out, and there's enough interlaced action. And when I say action, I'm just saying like the action between the characters, the conflict between the characters, to where you never feel drawn out or, oh my gosh, this is going too long, or this has just been, we spent way too much time talking about this one subject. They bounce around a lot, and you can really start to see and feel the stress. I mentioned PTSD, the post-traumatic stress that all of these soldiers are dealing with. And then the one outlier, which is Bob, who is the husband of Anne Ramsey's character, Marla. He's her, but she worked in the Pentagon. So he worked during World War II. Like, he was in World War II in a way, but he worked at the Pentagon. He was they call him a paper pusher or something at that point. Like, he was not a soldier on the ground in Germany or Japan or wherever. So you have all these shared experiences of what they went through in the war together. And to me, Patrick, and again, I'm not saying like this film's perfect by any means. Obviously, we'll talk about flaws here and there, but I never really got bored with that, I guess is what I'm getting at. Like, that to me is the sign of a solid script and solid dialogue, is I never felt bored with it. When they were telling the stories and they were reaching back into past times, which we know, remember when can be a very lazy storytelling device. Like, when you're just remember when, it can get that way. It can feel that way, that it's a lazy device when you're dealing with a smaller budget or something like that. In this particular case, to me, it worked every single time. I never got bored. I never lost interest. And it's still a tight movie. It's a 92-minute movie or whatever. It's not like it's a 2.5-hour movie. It's a 92-minute movie. So not a ton of road in front of them, yet they use it extremely well.
They do. I think they Ted really emphasized, like, okay, let's escalate every character through every, I'll call them scenes. We don't really move from place to place. But basically kind of they start with one topic. Like you said, it kind of starts jovial and kind of buddying around. And then there's just enough of something to give a hint that something's coming. And then he hits you with like a big change, like something happens. Like the first big change is the seance. I won't go into anything further because we'll get into that in spoilers. But he manages to keep this rhythm going where it's like, let's keep kind of escalating what's happening between these people, and then bang, hit them with something. So that way, if you were being lulled by any stretch, something happens in the room that takes it to the next level. I drop a little something in, and then it will pay off a little bit later. It's judicious, you know, and it's efficient for a movie like this. And I think you have to be. You could be lazy. You could just talk this movie to death. I was watching another movie that had tons of locations, that was actually beautifully shot, well acted, but basically it was just talking from location to location to location, little bits of something. I don't know. I didn't get all the way through the movie because it kind of talked itself to death. But that happens a lot. And this movie, while it needs to rely on conversation and character development through conversation, it manages to use everything that it has at its disposal to be effective. And I don't know how much farther I can really go without getting into spoilers, but one more thing I did want to reemphasize that you were talking about was the more mature approach for a World War II movie of talking about the PTSD. I think they called it shell shock back then, of how it's affecting each and every one of these characters. I think is a really mature thing to do. We sort of romanticize World War II for us, like some great big victory, like we defeated the Nazis. We didn't really, the Russians did. Anyway, but my point is, like, we do look upon World War II with rose-colored glasses, and we rarely look at how it affects people. And all of these characters, Archie, Marla, Hawk, DeFranco, they're all very affected by the war, and they've all come back with different weight on their shoulders. And I love that, and I really appreciated that, because it's way more nuanced than you ever normally see in a World War II movie.
Yeah, real quick, before we get to spoilers, I do want to mention one other element of this film. We talk about it is a seance. They go there, and this is very, you can watch the trailer and get this, is that, one of the characters, Larry Fessenden's character, his wife had killed herself, and that's part of why they're there. They're there to support him because they all served together during the war, and they're there to basically show support for him 6 weeks after her death. But then from there, it shifts into this, where he's like, I want to reach out to her. I want to speak to her through this seance. And they all kind of appease him a little bit. Like, they're all very like, this is stupid. Like, this is hokey, but they also understand this is kind of what this guy needs. And none of them buy it. None of them really believe it, that it's real. They're like, we'll go through the motions to try to help him because he's grieving right now. He's grieving, and he's also dealing with, as you mentioned, shell shock or post-traumatic stress. So it's like a combination of just horrible things this poor guy's gone through. There is a supernatural element to this film, just to be clear. Like, it's not, there is a supernatural element. You can see that in the trailer. What I enjoyed about this was, though, is that the funny thing is, I think the scarier elements of this film are real life.
Yeah.
Are what they did and what they had to go through in war. And they do a real, again, without any flashbacks or seeing what they did, they talk about it in such a way that it's very visceral, very real. And you don't feel lost in the details, and you don't feel, again, like there's too much exposition. And there were a couple of harrowing moments in this film where I'm like, damn, like that's really hard, like what you go through and what you had to do to survive. And that, to me, was scarier than anything supernatural in this film. And there is a supernatural element. We'll get into that more in spoilers. But, yeah, I really enjoyed that aspect because, like I said, there's a fine line. I love... everybody in my family has served in the military. I was one of the few that didn't. So I grew up in a military family. I grew up around the military, and I watch a lot of military movies. I was just watching Full Metal Jacket a couple nights ago, which is an incredible film. And I like war. I like war movies. I like military movies. And some get it, some don't. I have enough family members, people around the military that have told me, like, oh yeah, that's fairly accurate or that's bullshit. I can't say with World War II because, again, everything I know about World War II is through secondhand, through books or movies or school. But it felt real. Like, it felt real what they were going through and what they had to do to survive and what they did to get back home again. Like, that all felt very real and very true, and it was horrifying. Like, it was horrifying to think about some of the things you had to do. They say war is hell. They tell that in such a way in this film that it makes sense. As a person who obviously didn't grow up in World War II, doesn't have any firsthand experience of World War II, yet this felt real.
That's a great segue into spoilers, because my next comment would be about the spoiler, something that's spoilery and not in the trailer. So I'll go ahead and usher us into spoilers, Damon. And our spoilers, of course, are brought to you by the Rewind of the Living Dead t-shirt. It's a limited run, folks, made by the same company that prints for Cavity Colors and Fright Rags. Super high quality multicolor screen printed t-shirts, sizes small to XXL. Get them while they last. As you can see, they're going right now. Damon has been sending out orders. Get yours at rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com. That's rewindofthelivingdead.bigcartel.com.
Go get it. Go get it.
Get it.
Go get it. All right, let's get into spoilers, and let's kick off there. Because there is a lot to get to in this film that we can't really talk about with spoilers. So let's get into spoilers. So Patrick, make your point. Talk about what you want to talk about with the spoiler section. We're coming off what I just said about the sharing of the atrocities of war.
Yes, the atrocities of war. Again, very mature approach to this movie, and really, like, on its face. I actually saw previews for it. I didn't get to watch it at South by Southwest. It was very hard to get into screenings, but I would see it around there. I thought it was a comedy. The truth is, this movie takes the war very seriously. And when you mentioned atrocities, something like went off in my head. So a big part of this movie is that Hawk's wife killed herself because no one would believe that some German people that lived in her building were after her. She's like, they're after us because we were in the war. These Nazis have infiltrated. They live here, and they know that we know who they are. And they're coming after me, and no one believes me, including my own husband. So she ends up killing herself. So we think. They start the seance. Some supernatural shit starts. They explain very little about the seance, and the seance works immediately. And I kind of appreciate it. For a situation like this, it needed to be efficient, and that's smart. And so the seance starts. There's some, like, this necklace starts kind of pointing around the room and doing this weird shit. And then this door on the side of the room, very much like a horror fun house or something, starts banging. And you're like, oh, that's crazy. That's happening right in the middle of the seance. It's super weird. Well, it turns out that door that's banging and clattering was not the work of some sort of evil or supernatural spirit, which we did see, and there is evidence of. It was actually the German that Hawk's wife, Susie, was claiming was after her. Hawk had that German tied up in that room. And he wanted this seance to first and foremost prove that Susie was somewhere, because he talked about dealing with his issues with faith, and he tried through the church to believe that she was somewhere else, and he just couldn't buy it. So he's going to do, this was his last chance. And if the seance works, and Susie comes back, or Susie shows herself in some way, shape, or form, then I know what I have to do next. That's super important to the plot. Susie does come back in some way, shape, or form, like her arm, like, manifests itself from weird white vomit. I didn't quite understand that. And so everyone's like, I definitely heard Susie's voice. Everybody confirms it there. And they saw this crazy arm manifest itself out of slime, vomit slime. So surely whatever's banging on the door must be a spirit trying to get in. Well, in that moment, of all the craziness, they break their one rule. They break the circle before the seance is done. And therein lies, like, how we're going to, the catalyst for the rest of the movie, that breaking that seance locks them in the room until the seance is finished. That's the rule. And then out comes the German lady. And they have a lot of back and forth about, why she's tied up, why Hawk tied her up. Well, Hawk tied her up because if his wife was telling the truth, it's time to kill that German woman. She was definitely a Nazi. And the rest of the room is like, hey, okay, we know that the seance worked and all, but that doesn't mean she's a Nazi. So we're going to have to, like, figure that part out. And then that sort of turns everybody in the room against themselves, or against each other rather. And they start kind of pointing fingers because each one of them had a hand in the war. And this gets back to your point about atrocities. War is a two-way street. And I'm not getting political. I'm just saying, war, what is it good for? Absolutely nothing. I don't know. I really don't know. But what I do know is that both sides are killing people. And they get into that here. And that gets intense. They talk about, what Archie did. They talk about what Hawk ordered people to do. They talk about what Paul did. They talk about Marla, who was a world-class interrogator. They almost like are, turned on by the ability for Marla to get anything out of a Nazi through interrogation methods. And what they're talking about is torture. They get into like, hey, we did bad shit too. I'm not going both sides on that. Don't read into this. I'm just saying they did ugly things because ugly things have to be done during war. And I was pretty impressed that Ted could manifest that so eloquently in this movie because war is an ugly thing. War is nasty.
You can see they're all morally conflicted. I mean, as you said,
yes,
war is hell. And they all, every action that they're carrying out, with the exception of one really bad one, which is an order that Hawk gave to Arch, which is he threw a string of grenades into a schoolhouse and killed a bunch of children, which he's actually on trial for now as like a war crime. That everything they're doing was in the name of winning the war, but that doesn't mean morally inside you don't feel bad about it.
Right.
There's a weird, I think that's part of the disconnect that when you're not a soldier, and I'm certainly not a soldier, I just know a lot of soldiers. Like we all, when they come, I'm a big supporter of veterans. I support the military, especially guys that have come back from service. And we all want to pat them on the back and say, great job, great way to serve your country. And we want to celebrate them. And then we tend to forget about them. That's probably the problem in this country is veterans come home, we say, great job, and then just forget about what they did. Part of that post-traumatic stress isn't just like what they saw, it's what they had to do. Mm-hmm. And to win the war, like you said, this is not a both sides argument, but in this case, let's just say Marla as an example. You mentioned she's an interrogator. She uses torture as a device for her interrogations. Of course, that's her job. When she has to do horrible things, like whatever it is, and we see in this case, which is a really unnerving scene where she drives a hairpin into the German lady's nail as her device of torture of her device while she's interrogating her.
Yeah,
really,
I'm still.
Yeah, my hand. I'm right. I'm twisting my hand. I'm twisting my hand right now,
shaking it out right now.
In the sake of gaining knowledge, in the sake of winning the war, what Marla did was totally within the boundaries of her job.
Yeah.
And Nazis were the worst of the worst. We all know that. We all know the Nazis were the worst of the worst. But at the same time, you can still feel morally conflicted about driving nails into someone's fingernails or waterboarding them or torturing
blowing
them.
Up a school. Yeah, it's still bad.
You can still feel morally conflicted even if you know it was the right. I think that is what they did really well in this film, is that every action that these guys carried out and woman they carried out, they understand it's justified. And I imagine that's even harder to wrap your head around when you know you did well. Obviously, throwing a string of grenades into a schoolhouse and killing 50 children, probably not a good idea no matter where you're at. But in general speaking, but also let's not forget he was following an order. His order came from his superior officer, who was Hawk. The way they do this, like I said, that to me was probably my favorite part of the film, honestly, was that part of it. Because imagine you're in war and you're getting an officer or commanding officer is giving you an order to carry out, and you know it's a horrible thing you got to do, whatever that is. In the sake of following orders and winning the war, you did it. So you did your job. Yeah. But that doesn't mean your job wasn't awful.
And it doesn't mean that your job totally fucked you up.
Yeah.
Totally fucked you up.
They do a really good job of really showing, because they all show up and they're all like, oh, it's so great to see you. We're all home again. We grew up to blah, blah, blah. It's all jovial and happy. And it quickly dissolves into tragedy and PTSD, and then just everything these people are dealing with, particularly with Hawk, where, you know, he ends up, he does the seance. They have proof that Susie is on the other side, or she's somewhere out there. She's not just there was also that great scene I want to bring up. You mentioned that he had turned to the church immediately after this, and he was getting support from faith and support from the church. And then the church told him, well, Susie's burning in hell because she killed herself. She took her own life. And he's just like, hold the fuck on. Like, this isn't what I came here for. I came here for comfort, not finding out that my wife is burning in hell. And so he shunned the church. And so the seance was the next step of that. And as soon as he finds out, like, an arm pops out of the table, we realize it's Susie. They hear her voice. They're all convinced it's Susie. They just don't know what to think of it. Hawk is just like, I know she's out there somewhere. I'm going to go join her, and blows his head off. And it's just like so jarring. And you kind of get that, like, it's this entire film is centered around what these people had to do, how they're dealing with what they've done. And so the supernatural element, while it is still an important part, really goes in the background. Like, it's there and it plays a part. But it's really it's really like a B story to the bigger A story, which is what these soldiers are dealing with coming home from a war that's now over.
Exactly. And by the way, to fully clarify, if anyone is confused, Rewind of the Living Dead, that's Damon, myself, and Tez. Fuck Nazis. We think they're the worst thing that ever happened in the existence of the human race. Just in case anyone's confused from that long discussion about it, these people are deeply affected by what's going on there, right? And you're right. And Hawk decides, okay, she's out there somewhere. Bang, I'm out too, and I'll go find her. Great, that's wonderful. But he leaves, as he did, as was his way in the war. He leaves the killing up to everybody in the room. That's the kind of the bridge between the supernatural and what's happening in the real world, is him saying, like, okay, I'm convinced that the Nazi that the woman I locked up in that closet is a Nazi. You all have to finish that job for me, because that's definitely a Nazi. I'm convinced, and you guys need to do it. And therein lies the moral quandary, which is which one of us are going to do it, or which one of us is going to convince the rest of us that that is definitely not a Nazi, and that Hawk and Susie were crazy, that they had just gone crazy because of the war, and they were insistent that just because this woman had a German accent, she was a Nazi. So it creates a moral quandary for this group of people who are already suffering from moral quandaries. And so it's a weirdly smart movie like that. Like it doesn't like bang you over the head, but as you put all the pieces together, you go, well, holy shit, this is pretty damn nuanced.
It's very dark. Very dark.
It's dark without being like dark in the traditional sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really dark, and it's just, like I said, you can really see what these people have gone through. And like I said, that to me was the most interesting part of the movie.
Very much so.
And it becomes a drama about the stress and the trauma of what these people have dealt with, what they brought home with them again, and what they're still willing to do in the face of carrying out orders or carrying out a mission, so to speak. That blind patriotism we talked about.
Right.
Or, you know, one person in particular, which is DeFranco, Major DeFranco. He's just like, Hawk was his best friend. That was the job he was supposed to be the one to carry out the mission to kill the German lady. And so that's him. Like, he's like, we killed Nazis. That's what we do. Hawk told us she's a Nazi. I'm going to kill her. And the other characters are kind of like, no, hold on. Like, the war is over. Like, you know, there's no proof that this lady's actually a Nazi. And then they're dealing with the moral conundrum of that. Like, do you just blindly follow orders even in the war being over? Do we need proof that this woman actually is a Nazi? Like, they'd all been convinced that, like, Susie, his wife, was not well. She just didn't come back from the war the same as she went in, and she just was not. And so she was paranoid and looking for a boogeyman around every corner. She found what we believe is a convenient boogeyman 3 doors down, which is this German family that had lived there supposedly since 1931. And she just believed that they were spying on them, that they were there to hurt them. And no one believed her. And that lack of belief eventually led to her, you know, taking her own life. And so it's a lot of morality and a lot of very dark morality in what they're dealing with and what they dealt with and what they're still dealing with. So I really enjoyed that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's a much more complex movie than you would ever imagine. Look how much time we were able to talk about a single room movie. That's how dense Ted managed to make it.
Yeah, so let's get into categories. Let's kick things off as we do each and every week here on the show, Patrick. We're going to talk about best performance. Again, very small cast. And again, to give credit where credit's due, this was a really, really good cast. Like, they did a really, really solid job all the way through. Everyone was good. But Patrick, who was your best performance in Brooklyn 45?
My best performance goes to Larry Fessenden as Hawk, as Lieutenant Colonel Hawk. You know, he has just a lot of great, and he's only, by the way, in the first like quarter of the movie because he offs himself. But man, he had a real presence here. And let me tell you about Larry. I think a lot of people know him from tons of genre stuff. Most recently, the one I can think of just off the top of my head, he works constantly. But I think of Jacob's Wife, which we reviewed on this show. He was in that, and he was great in that too. He's not the most imposing guy. He's kind of shorter, balding, and older. He doesn't come off like he's got anything on anybody, but all these people in this room, all these soldiers, you know, DeFranco's like real stiff and with the high and tight haircut, and Archie's kind of big and barrel chested. You wouldn't think that he could boss those guys around, but something about him can. And I think that goes to Larry's performance. I think he knew how to command what he was doing. And then also he has a great turn later in the movie, which is while he's laying there or slumped over dead on the table from his gunshot wound, he then becomes like an ethereal spirit, and that's like a whole new turn for his character. So I looked at this and I go, yeah, everybody's doing a great job, but Larry's doing multiple jobs and he's doing a great job at it.
Yeah, he really is great. I mean, I really like Larry Fessenden. I think I first came across him when he appeared in Session 9, which is probably one of my favorite horror films of all time. He makes a small appearance in that movie, but he's been in a million things. You mentioned Jacob's Wife. He does a tremendous job in this movie and really sells it. And again, it kind of reminds me a little bit of, I know this is a weird correlation with this movie and another one, but it reminds me a little bit of A Few Good Men. A Few Good Men.
Oh, yeah.
It's also originally a play, by Aaron Sorkin that becomes a movie. One thing they talk about in that film, which is not that the movie's like 30 years old, so this isn't really a spoiler for A Few Good Men. But one thing they talk about in that film, Jack Nicholson's character, he talks about like, you follow orders or people die. That's a big part of that movie is you follow orders or people die. We do not have a choice when we're in the military. We have to follow orders. And what I liked about Larry Fessenden's character, as you mentioned, is he's not an imposing force. He's not the biggest guy in the room. He's not the whatever, but he's a commander, commander. And I like that he takes charge of that. So yeah, he does a tremendous job. I really liked his performance. For me personally, I lean towards Larry Fessenden as well. I thought he did an incredible job, but I actually want to give a shout to Anne Ramsey, who played Marla.
Yeah.
I was not super familiar with her. I know she was in Mad About You for several seasons, but I knew her from A League of Their Own was the one movie of hers I was really familiar with.
Okay.
Tom Hanks, Gina Davis movie. She does a tremendous job. Very dark. She's the one, the reason I really liked Anne Ramsey's performance is because she's the one who really had to do a lot of, up close, personal, awful shit, torturing people. Like, you could tell, like that.
Yeah.
And she's also the one, you get a sense very early on that she's the one trying the hardest to move on. Like, she's trying really hard to forget about that. And they draw her back in by forcing her to question the German lady if she is or is not a Nazi. And you can see how uncomfortable it is for her because out of the context of war, this is an atrocity. Like, no one wants to see you driving a hairpin into someone's fingernail because that's horrible. But again, in the cause of war, she was totally justified to do what she did. She doesn't want to go back there. She's moved on. Her husband, she's happy, even though none of her friends like her husband. Like, she's all happy, and she's genuinely trying to move on and forget about what she had to do during war. Yet they will not let her. They will not let her forget what she had to do and what she became so good at doing. I love that, and I love the tragedy of that. That like she's the one desperately trying to move on. She seems genuinely happy with the life she's found with her husband now that the war's over, and yet her fellow veterans will not let her forget.
Yeah, I think she is. By the way, I think she's. I would call her probably the top billed character in the movie. I think this is actually her movie. Her fellow veterans look at her as the strong one, like the mentally the most strong one. Not only because of what she had to do in the war, she's. You're right. She's got this ability to kind of be calmer about it, while the rest of them are kind of scratching for clarity. She's like, I'm kind of already there and I don't want to dive back into this. And they're like, well, you got to help us figure this out because you might be the only one with the level head here. So the movie does kind of hinge on her conflict. And then she does eventually do that incredible interrogation scene, which is, I mean, man, my hand hurts thinking about it right now. But yeah,
stomach churning scene.
Yeah, but she's a solid performer, man. She really was able to carry this movie as sort of not the moral center, because I don't even think she saw herself as that, but as just sort of the anchor, the person down to earth that was able to say like, hold on, like let's really evaluate all of this.
Yeah. Let's talk about best character, favorite character in this movie, because again, we're dealing with a small cast, only so many people in the movie. So Patrick, who is your favorite character in Brooklyn 45?
My favorite character was her husband, Bob. I really love Bobo. First of all, like everyone hated him and he hated everybody. And I think it was just because of what you said is he was a pencil pusher. He was a Pentagon office intelligence guy. You know, he's just more of an intellect and all that stuff. Well, they all had to get their hands dirty. So they don't respect Bob. And that permeates throughout the entire movie. And Bob sort of, you know, as much as he knows he couldn't win a fist fight with any of these guys, he still kind of stands his ground. And Marla stands up for her husband as well. But what I love too is that all these guys are like, Bob, you're a fuck, basically like, Bob, you're a pussy. You never did any of this shit. You sat at a desk in Washington, D.C. while the rest of us got our hands dirty. And in the end, he's the one that closes the seance out. While all these soldiers, Marla included, debated what to do, he went, we need to finish this damn thing. Paul was getting way out of hand, way overcharged. He shoots Paul right in the head. Then he turns around and he shoots the Nazi in the head too, because it turns out she was a Nazi. And it closes the seance and then opens the doors and everybody gets to go home except for Paul and the Nazi, thanks to Bob.
Yeah. So I'm going to disagree with you slightly. We still don't know for sure that she was a Nazi. They never tell us that for sure. We assume because the seance ends that it was. But let's also, the reason I want to bring this up, this is like the conundrum in this movie I'm curious about, is that Susie, even in her afterlife, and then obviously Hawk, her husband, through extension, because he didn't believe her and he felt guilty about that, and then she took her own life. And they had this great little story where they said that, you know, basically she framed it, like the German killed Susie, framed it like she had committed suicide.
Poisoned her.
But we still don't know. Like, and so there was this, like, again, that goes back to the morality of this movie. Like, we never find out with 100% accuracy what she was. She never confesses. I thought there was going to be, during that interrogation, I actually thought she was going to finally slip up and confess. And we're going to be like, holy shit, she was right all along. They never quite 100% definitively tell you that. Now, I tend to lean where you lean, which is she was, and that's why it all worked out. But we also have to remember, even in death, Susie and Hawk were still convinced she was a Nazi. We have no true, real idea was she or not. And I like that there's that morality clause. Like, you're not 100% sure. And I think that's the entire point of this film is, like, we don't know. Like, how far will you carry this out to follow a belief structure? And I love that they never fully tell you.
I guess they never do. I'm in the next category, I feel like is the tell, but go ahead.
Yeah. So with that being said, when I say favorite character, and when I say this, I'm not saying it because I was on board with her. I'm saying it because she did a really good job of like trying to confuse us, and that was Hildy, the German, Hildy Bauman, because she does such a good job of like playing the damsel in distress, the wounded fawn, so to speak. And she's so strong in that performance that you're not sure. You question it. Throughout the entire film, you question it. And there are moments where you genuinely feel bad for her, where you're supposed to feel bad for her. You're kind of like, man, these people are completely unhinged. And here's this poor woman, mother of two, she's gotten drawn into this and whatever. But then by the end, you wonder, like, is there something more sinister hiding behind her eyes? And I really enjoyed that. I guess this kind of blends a little bit with favorite performance, but the reason I like that is because she is the outsider. She had nothing to do with any of these people. She wasn't in the war with them. She's not married to any of them. She was kidnapped and shoved in a closet, and now she's being accused of all these atrocities. And I love the moral ambiguity with that character where you're not quite sure. So when I say favorite character, again, stating Rewind of the Living Dead hates Nazis, but that character was so well crafted that you just don't know. You just didn't know, and you're meant to feel bad for her, and they do that really well.
She would have been a shoo-in for like a runner-up for best performance for sure. She had a lot to work with, and she was doing well with it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. All right, let's move on to best scare. There are some scares in this movie. So what is your best scare in Brooklyn 45?
Well, my best scare kind of goes along with the idea of why I think she was indeed a Nazi, which is, now again, I mentioned like throughout this movie, it's like talking, and then another escalation, another something happens to kind of push the movie further, another rocket booster, if you will. And at one point, during all the chaos and debating of whether we should kill this person or whether they're a Nazi or not, Hawk starts speaking from beyond the grave in the fucking creepiest voice I've ever fucking heard. And so to me, it wasn't like scary. It was creepy that his head just laid there on the table covered in blood. And he started saying, somebody is going to do something. Like he's saying, like, somebody in here has to do it. So to me, that was sort of the tell, was like, now he's in the beyond. Sure, he could also be crazy in the beyond. You would hope there's a bit of clarity in the beyond, but it seemed to be saying, like, from the beyond, like, I have to forcibly come in here and say there is no other way around this. If you want out of this room, which everybody desperately did, you have to kill this woman. She is a Nazi. And then they do it, and then everyone gets out of the room. So in my opinion, that was my bit of proof, and also my best scare.
So that was a good one. And my best scare actually comes slightly before that, which was early in the film when you're doing the seance and you kind of see everyone is kind of going through the motions of just trying to appease Hawk and just try to give him some support during a very tragic time in his life. Then they do the seance and shit actually happens. The closet starts banging, which again, we find out is actually the German woman locked in the closet. But then the necklace that he has, the locket he has with a little piece of something that belonged to Susie goes flying in the air and it kind of zooms around almost like a compass in a way.
Divining rod.
Yeah. And then, you know, the weird white vomit thing, but then the arm shoots out of it and like basically points around the room and they hear Susie's voice. So they all know something is going on here. Something is actually happening. How much they believe, we don't know, but they know something is happening. And it's just a really stunning shift because in that moment, like, Hawk is feeling guilty for not believing his wife. She died, so he still blames himself. But then out of nowhere, he's just like, well, now I know Susie's out there. She's in another dimension. She's in another world, whether that's heaven, hell, wherever she's at, I want to be there with her. And out of nowhere, he just pulls a gun out and blows his head off. And I was just like, oh, shit.
Yeah.
It was just such a jarring moment because should I have seen it coming given the circumstances? Probably. But it was just so jarring how quickly it happened. Like, he was just like, oh, I know she's out there. Boom. We come to find out that was his plan all along because he wanted to reach out to her. And as soon as he had definitive proof that Susie was out there, he was going to take his own life. And that's why he had ordered Paul, his best friend, to kill the Nazi. When he got there, that's what he told him. You need to finish this mission for me. And that was his mission, was to kill the Nazi, because from the start, Hawk knew he was going to take his own life before he got any further. As soon as he had definitive proof that Susie was out there, Hawk was going to blow his head off. And I love that cause and effect of that because he was the commanding officer. He was the colonel. That's his job, is to dish out orders to his underlings. And ultimately, he even carried that out in death because you would think he would have killed the Nazi, stuffed the body in the closet and then took his own life, but he doesn't get his hands dirty.
He doesn't. That's part of his character trait.
Commanding officer, and I love that he delegated another person's murder just like he delegated orders in the war. I love that little wrinkle.
Yeah, it's another wrinkle exactly into his character trait, which is like he wrangled and all these soldiers to do his bidding for him. He's still that guy, even at the end of, he knows it's going to be the end of his life, but he's like, I don't do that shit. I don't even like seeing the sight of blood. So you all have to do that for me. It's just one little extra layer. Again, shouts to Ted Geoghegan for doing that, because I was like, fuck, that's pretty brilliant.
Yeah, it was just so dark. And like I said, I didn't really, sitting here talking about it made me rethink about it when he says that. Like, he just didn't want to that's his job. He's a commanding officer.
Yeah, he makes his soldiers do it for him.
You do what I tell you to do. I'm gonna go be with Susie. Fuck off, and you're gonna take it as with me.
Fuck off, indeed.
Exactly. All right. Let's talk about best gore, because there is some gore in here. Patrick, I know where you're going here. So, what was the best gore in Brooklyn 45?
Well, right on the heels of the idea that Hawk is insisting everybody do this, you know, they're still having this moral quandary. You're still having this back and forth. And finally, after the body commands them from beyond to do it, and they still don't do it, Hawk's body rears up and starts smashing his own face into the table, to the point that, I mean, my God, it looks like somebody took a fucking fire extinguisher to his face and hit him about 50 times. And then I think that was finally the last straw, and that's when Bob took the gun and was like, "Fuck all this! Like, we're ending this now." But it's so gory. It's like it's one of those things where we've talked about, where when you kind of have a limited budget, you save your money for the really best gag you can do. And looking at Larry Fessenbender's face, like fucking just mangled like that, I was like, "Damn, okay, that's where the money went."
And let's not forget, that's after he puts a moonroof in the back of his head from killing himself. So
yeah, he has a giant hole in the back of his head, but now the front of his head looks like roadkill.
There was one moment, I'm saying this like it's funny, and I don't mean it to be, I mean, I guess it is funny, but I remember he slams his head down, he raises his back up, he does this like several times, you keep getting like he keeps doing it, more and more gruesome gets added to his face, and there's one moment where he lowers down, slams his head in the desk, comes back up, and his jaw's kind of off to the center, and I was like, hey, he kind of looks like Edgar in Men in Black. Remember?
Yeah, totally, he totally did.
Vincent D'Onofrio was like, it didn't look like Edgar, he looked like he was wearing an Edgar suit. His jaw was all displaced. I was like, hey, he looks like from Men in Black. But yeah, that was really
right.
really disturbing, man. And he just continues to slam his head into the desk, like, do this, do it.
Fuck it. Like when you're so frustrated, you start slamming your own head into the desk. Yeah, I feel like he was sure she was a Nazi.
Yeah. So that was the best gore. But I'm going to throw out one other one again, just because it made me so uncomfortable, and that was the hairpin through the fingernail.
Oh.
Marla's character, she's talking to Hildy, and she's like, no, you're going to hold my, she's all very calm.
Calm.
You're going to hold my hand. I need you to answer questions, and I need you to answer them no matter how many times I ask you the same question. Do you understand? Hildy's crying. She's like, yes, I understand. What's your name? What's this? And then she's got this, she pulls out a pin from her hair, and she sticks it at the end of this lady's fingernail while she's holding her hand.
Oh.
And she's just like, I'm going to ask you the same question over and over again. You need to answer it. And she actually turns to her fellow soldiers, and she's like, damn you for making me do this. And she's just holding it there. And you can tell, like, if you don't, she never says it. But she's like, you can tell she's basically like, you answer me correctly and I believe you. You don't get this hairpin shoved to your fucking fingernail.
Oh, God.
And so it's really unnerving. And then at one point she starts jamming it in. I'm rubbing my fingernail right now. It is so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Close. Oh my God. So it's not super gory, but it's really uncomfortable watching a hairpin just slowly get jammed into this woman's finger. And it's just, oh my God, it's so, I mean, I got goosebumps right now talking about it.
It really is. It's one of those things. It's like the nail on the staircase, when you know they're going to step on it. It's not the goriest thing ever, but it will affect you more than all the other things.
Oh, got me so good. I was just like, oh no.
Oh, yay.
All right, next category, Patrick. We're going to talk remake, sequel, or leave it alone. This is the category where we take whatever horror movie we were reviewing this week and we basically talk about should they remake it, should they do a sequel, or should they just leave it alone as is. So with Brooklyn 45, Patrick, remake, sequel, leave it alone.
You know what? Part of my initial instinct was leave it alone because I think it's fine just the way it is. But I'm going to say something really weird here. I think Ted Gilligan did a great job. I actually want to say remake, and in this context, give Ted the budget he wanted, and I want to see what he's can do with it. Maybe he didn't even want a big budget. Maybe he just knew he could do it the way he could do it. But I'm curious to see what a big version of this movie would be with the same ideas put in place. Like, how far could you go? Like, give him a $150 million war epic and see what it looks like. See how it comes out. I'd be very curious because I think the storytelling and everything, the talent behind it is there. And I'm curious if he was hindered by the budget. But my gut instinct, honestly, is to say leave it alone. But I would be curious to see sort of a Malum type remake where it's like, okay, yeah, we did it the cheap way. Now let's do it the expensive way.
I get the sense from interviews that this is the movie he wanted to make, which is, you know, why he didn't do flashbacks, as we talked about, because he didn't want to take the viewer out of the room, which I enjoy that little nuance of this film. You never leave the room with him the entire time. So I
Good
do
tension.
that. But I appreciate what you're saying. My initial instinct, same thing. Leave it alone. This is a good film. No need to mess with it. I'll throw one little small wrinkle caveat in here. Mm-hmm. And I say sequel. And now when I say sequel, I don't mean a direct sequel, like we're going to catch up with Marla and Arch 10 years down the road. I think you could do a series of these films in similar-ish fashion. Obviously, you're going to have to switch it up, location, the situation, whatever, but I love the military aspect of this. Maybe you do one, you know, and it's like, you know, Brooklyn 93 at the end of the Desert Storm. Or, right. You know,
Brooklyn 1980 after Vietnam War.
Or Brooklyn, 2024, or it's not 2024, 2004 after 9/11 or whatever, you know, after the Afghanistan war. I think it would be an interesting character, you know, study to do more of these films set in different aspects of these kind of situations where you deal with such stress and such trauma that you're willing to reach out to the supernatural for answers, trying to figure out why this all happened. So in that regard, I think that could be a cool little series. I'm not saying continuation where Arch is going to come back and same characters, but I would, because my family, my brother served in Desert Storm. He's a lot older than me, so I still don't remember a lot of that, but I know he served. So I would be fascinated, like, because we all, you know, we're of our age, like, that's what we hear about is obviously 9/11, the war in Afghanistan, and of the Iran war, of course, and Desert Storm. Like, those are the two major big military operations during our lifetime. I think it would be kind of fascinating to explore that in another film like this. But I will say one other thing I want to mention. I forgot to mention this earlier. I love the setting of World War II for a lot of reasons, but one thing I did is they do away with technology, because if you're all trapped in a room and you can't get out, somebody just call for help. You know, on your cell phone.
Well, you could say, hey, I'm not getting a signal. You could do that.
They do that, and sometimes it's the laziest storytelling when they're just like, you can't get a signal anywhere. Ever.
Cell phones are ruining movies. It's a real thing. Like, they talk about it a lot.
What I appreciate are when films deal with that. Like, when you deal with the reality of that, and you don't just throw in a MacGuffin like, oh, we're in the middle of the woods, so we gotta have no signal. You know, think about all the times in your life.
They have the SOS feature now. They don't even have that.
Have no signal. You know what I mean? Like the world is not, so. Deal with it realistically. And in this film, it's in 1945. There was no cell phones. No one's calling for help.
If I'm making horror films, they don't go past 1990.
Yeah. If you're going to have a cell phone, it's going to be a big-ass brick phone, and it's only making it from here to across the street. So
a brick phone.
like nice guy Eddie carries in Reservoir Dogs, a giant freaking brick phone. All right, Patrick, this is a category, we call it Can We Survive This Horror Film? So this is a category where you and I put ourselves into whatever movie we're reviewing, and we say, could we survive this horror film? So, Patrick, Brooklyn 45, are we surviving?
Golly, if I was put in the situation of being one of the characters in that room, I'm very definitely Bob. And look how it turned out.
Yeah.
I think Bob made it out, and no one was betting on Bob making it out. So my initial instinct was to say no, because I've never served in the military. I've never had to do anything like that. So I was like, yeah, I probably wouldn't. But the only two who didn't make it out were the most hard-nosed ones. So I had to think that, yeah, I probably would make it out of this.
Yeah, I agree. I say yes for a couple of reasons. One, I've never served in the military either, so I can't speak to that experience. So again, kind of like you, I have to put myself in Bob's shoes. And you have to remember, the point of this film wasn't for everyone to die. Hawk wasn't trying to get his soldiers to die. He just wanted the German lady who he thought was a Nazi to die. So in that regard, you're pretty safe. Like, no one's necessarily pointing a gun at you saying, you're going to die, unless you're Hildy. And if you're Hildy, you're fucked. So that regard, like, yeah, I'm safe. And then also part B, when you talk about Bob, like, I would go into that with the most skepticism of anybody. I don't believe in seances. I don't believe in ghouls and ghosts and spirits. But as soon as that arm rises up out of the thing in 1945, when there's surely no special effects that can pull that off, then I'm a believer. Then I'm on board. Then I'm just like, oh, you want her dead? Okay, give me the gun.
Got it.
At that point, I'm believing whatever the hell you tell me. So, yeah, I would survive because, A, I'm not in the middle of it, so you're not wanting to kill me to begin with. And two, as soon as I saw that arm pop out of the table, I'm like, fuck this, give me the gun, she's going down.
Yeah, and at one point too, there was even sort of like a Ring-esque moment where she like crawled out, and I was like, "Oh yeah, somebody dying so I can get out of here because I'm not getting chased around by the vomit ghost."
Yeah, fuck that. I'm done. I'm out of here. Last but not least, every week we always like to end our categories with "Is it scary?" So Patrick, at the end of the day, Brooklyn 45, is it scary?
I don't think it's scary. I think it's sort of designed to be sort of a mystery noir. Like it's kind of dramatic. It's got a couple of small horror elements in it. I don't think it's designed to scare you. So I'm going to say no on this one.
I'm going to lean slightly towards yes for this regard because it's kind of disturbing. Kind of disturbing.
A little bit, yeah.
Because again, some of the stories they tell are a little horrifying. Some of the actions that are carried out are a little disturbing. So in that regard, I'll say it's that. It's a little disturbing. It's not fully scary. Really engaging film. Really well written, well directed, well acted. So I really enjoyed it. So when I say I say it's not really scary, I don't want to turn off the horror crowd. But I will say it is disturbing because, like I said, that nail scene when Hawk slams his face into the table 30 times and turns into mush, those do get a little like uncomfortable. So
and they don't turn away from his face. It's not suggested. You got to stare at it.
Yeah, and you see each successive slam into the table mangles his face even more. So yeah, again, I would say in that regard, yeah, it is disturbing. So I would go that far. All right, folks. That is our show for this week. Obviously, we want to say a big thank you to everyone that tunes in to Rewind of the Living Dead each and every week. Make sure you check us out on all your favorite podcast platforms, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and of course my website, nerdcoremovement.com. And you can also check us out on YouTube. Just search Rewind of the Living Dead. Please subscribe to us over there. We need to build our subscribers on YouTube, so please, please, please go find us over there. And we post new episodes on there every week. And you can even see us. You may want us to look like Hawk did after he slammed his head into the desk a bunch of times. But for now, I'm going to hope that you don't. You got questions, comments, just like our listener earlier, Brad, if you got questions, comments, movies you'd like us to review, hit us up on email. Did I get the name right? Did I remember the name right? Was it?
I think it was. Now I don't have it pulled up, but yeah, I mean, point is, thank you for sending that email instead of all the dick pics we get.
Yes, it was Brad. It was Brad. Sorry.
It was Brad.
I was right. If you got questions, you got comments, you got movies you would like us to review, please send us emails. We love getting those. ROTLivingdead@gmail.com. That's rotlivingdead@gmail.com. And you can also send us those questions, those comments, those movies you'd like us to review.
That inside knowledge that they give us. I like that.
You can also send that on social media. We are on Twitter, we are on Facebook, and we are on Instagram. Just search Rewind of the Living Dead, and you will find us on any of those platforms. Or you can follow us on our own personal social media channels. I am at Damon Martin, and you are?
At Director Patrick.
A big thank you, as always, for everyone that tunes in each and every week to the show. We'll be back next week with another edition of Rewind of the Living Dead. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you then.
Peace.